Welkom allemaal, dank dat u er bent. Ik ben Ghana Luden, directeur van CIDI. A special welcome to our guest and speaker of today, Jonathan Spire, and to James Sorin, the CEO of BICOM, our sister organization in Britain. James is eating his nails today, as you can imagine, with the elections on the other side of the channel. Before I give Jonathan the floor, I'd like to say a few words about our work here at CIDI. And I'll do it mostly in English, if you don't mind, Jonathan. I don't see Jonathan, by the way. You are here, yes. CIDI houdt zich bezig met politiek in Nederland ten aanzien van Israël en pleit voor berichtgeving en politiek die recht doen aan de werkelijke situatie en context aldaar. Het recht op vredig en veilig bestaan van de bewoners van de staat Israël is ons uitgangspunt. En de hoop op vrede tussen Israël en haar buren blijft ons belangrijkste aandachtspunt en drijfveer. Het gaat om die buren en hun handlangers die deze instabiele regio openlijk Israëls bestaan bedreigen. En de wereld kijkt toe en vindt het kennelijk normaal. Maar het gaat ook om de Palestijnen. Degenen die in de Gazastrook wonen, in de westelijke Jordaanoever, in de verschillende vluchtelingenkampen. En het gaat ook, en misschien vooral, over de inwoners van de staat Israël zelf. Israëli, Joods, Arabier en anderszins. Allemaal willen ze een gewoon leven kunnen leiden, een goed bestaan hebben. En willen ze natuurlijk doorgaan waar ze goed in zijn, de wereld goede zaken aanbieden en voor de wereld goede zaken betekenen. Ons werk heeft ook een belangrijk element hier in Nederland, op het gebied van antisemitisme. De verharding en verroeiing zijn helaas kenmerkend van onze tijd. En wij zien een groei in het aantal en de heftigheid van antisemitische incidenten. Zelfs een zogenaamde criminele act, zoals deze week in New Jersey, blijkt op zijn minst een antisemitische rand te hebben en misschien erger dan dat. CIDI vecht voor een samenleving vrij van vooroordelen, haat, discriminatie en antisemitisme. De oude vooroordelen, waarvan we dachten dat ze al lang niet meer bestonden, blijken alive en kicking. Onze taak is deze te bevechten, met jullie hulp. Je kunt bij ons antisemitische incidenten melden. Je kunt met ons overleggen wat de beste aanpak zou moeten zijn in elke situatie. En u kunt ons werk natuurlijk volgen. Je kunt bij ons ook terecht als je een situatie hebt waarvan je denkt van ik moet bij politie, op school van mijn kinderen, met vrienden en een andere uitleggen of misschien bevechten zelfs. Je kunt ons hulp, advies en zelfs onze acties vragen. Begin volgend jaar zullen we weer onze monitor antisemitische incidenten publiceren. Ik zag in de zaal Hadassah, die ooit is begonnen met deze monitor. Deze monitor publiceren we al vele jaren en het voordeel daarvan is dat we trends kunnen zien in hoe zaken zich ontwikkelen en waar de belangrijkste aandachtspunten zijn. Ook dit jaar zullen we dat doen. We gebruiken de monitor om met beleidsmakers en de politiek te bespreken hoe antisemitisme bevochten kan worden. Ook dit jaar. Zoals u weet is de politiek inmiddels doordrongen van de noodzaak om antisemitisme te bestrijden. Wij, CIDI, zijn er om ervoor te zorgen dat het niet alleen bij woorden blijft, maar echt tot acties leidt. En wij zijn er om ervoor te zorgen dat de acties uitgevoerd worden, geëvalueerd en uiteindelijk tot effectief resultaat leiden. We hebben vandaag Jonathan Spire uitgenodigd om ons te vertellen over de strategische ontwikkelingen in het Midden-Oosten. Jonathan, this is what we wrote about this lecture. The civil war in Syria has calmed down a bit after years of heavy fights. The terror group Hezbollah, who supported President Abbas very strongly, to keep his reign, is now reshifting its attention to her own agenda, fighting and attacking Israel. They are now stronger and more experienced than ever before, and much better equipped militarily and otherwise. This as well as other interventions and interveners in the region, are of great concern to Israel. Is war in the region a real threat? This is the question of today. I'm pleased to introduce Jonathan Spire to you. Jonathan holds a PhD from the London School of Economics, and he's an expert on strategic development in the Middle East. He's probably the only Israeli that has recently traveled to Syria and to Iraq. He's also been in Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan. Spire works for the Jerusalem Institute of Strategic Studies and with the American Middle East Forum. He publishes regularly in Jane's Intelligence Review, in the Middle East Quarterly, and other professional bulletins, as well as newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal, the Jerusalem Post, and the Times. Jonathan will first talk for about 40 minutes, and after that we will hold, you can pose your questions, which he will gladly answer. We will try to finish around 9:30, and then of course we have time for less formal questions, answers, discussions. Jonathan, floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and good evening to everybody. So what I'm going to do is speak at you for about 40 minutes, after which we will have an interesting, I have no doubt, discussion and conversation. What I want to try and do in these initial 40 minutes really is to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the Middle East in terms of looking at the key, I guess, strategic trend lines and developments, at least as I see them, and the key players active within the space. And then we can try at the end to ask where Israel and Israel's situation fits into that, and then we can move on to our conversation. So to get straight to it, let me begin by saying the following. It will not cause anybody to fall off their chair, I assume, or certainly hope, to say that the Middle East is in a period of very great turmoil and uncertainty. But we need to complicate that picture, I think, in an interesting way. We're 10 years into a period in which change in the Middle East is being led from below. It's being led by processes emerging from within the civil societies, primarily of the Arab world, and causing instability and fragmentation and change. Now, that's not something to be taken for granted in the Middle East. Interestingly, we tend to think of the Middle East being unstable, but it's actually an interesting fact to note that in the Arabic-speaking world, for the most part, up until about 10 years ago, the situation was characterized by a kind of combination of a certain stability along with complete failure and dysfunctionality. Regimes failed on more or less every measurable gauge to develop economies, to develop civil societies, to develop political systems, even to develop national identities that people wanted to be part of, but the regimes tended to stick around. They tended to be good at keeping themselves in power. If we think of the army in Egypt, if we think of the Ba'ath Party in Syria, if we think of the various monarchies, if we think of the Ba'ath Party also in Iraq, at least until the Americans came in 2003 and destroyed it, the combination was one of failure and longevity. Now, around 10 years ago, that changed and transformed itself. And, sorry, what's this?
A headset.
You can leave it, never mind. I was asking for a mic stand, is what I wanted, but it would help me. If you can't get one of those, never mind. So the issue was one of failure and longevity. This situation transformed, of course, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, beginning in Tunisia, spreading to Egypt, then, of course, to Syria, to Libya, and to Yemen. What we witnessed was a process of revolution, counter-revolution, civil war, election, military coup, and change. And we're around 10 years into that process. It was initially called the Arab Spring. Nobody calls it that anymore, but we're aware of what we're talking about. Now, had I been giving this talk even 4 or 5 months ago, I would probably have said at this stage something like, and we think that this wave of change from below has for the moment largely spent itself. Right? And I would have said, at the moment, if we look at our map of the region, we can't see many processes of change led from below. As of early October, we need to revise that picture once again, because, of course, there is today very serious unrest led from below in Lebanon, in Iraq, and latterly also in Iran. So this process of change from below has not yet spent itself. As we look at the landscape a decade into this process of change, what do we see? What has changed as a result of this great wave of instability? Well, the first thing to note is what has not changed, right? Many of us were hoping that as a result of the wave of change which entered the region in Tunisia in 2010, there would be born more representative forms of governance in the Arabic-speaking world. By and large, that is not what has taken place. There is one exception, which interestingly is the place where the Arab Spring started, which is Tunisia, which does now have something resembling a functioning electoral system. But elsewhere, that's clearly not what has been born as a result of the Arab Spring. So what then nevertheless has been born? I would suggest what we can find as a commonality in a number of the countries where change took place is that an effective fragmentation and partial collapse of the country in question and of its systems has taken place as a result of instability led from below. That's to say, if we look across a broad swathe of the Arabic-speaking world today, we find areas in which there is no really fully functioning state at all, or no entity performing the full amount of duties and functions we would tend to expect of a state, obviously most crucial of those being the one which Max Weber identified, the state being the body that has the monopoly over the means of violence, yeah, and plus other functions. No fully functioning state at all in Libya, no fully functioning state at all in Yemen, but most importantly for us in Israel, because of where we are located, of course, no fully functioning state in that entire landmass between the Mediterranean Sea and the Iraq-Iran border, taking in three nominal states, of course, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Throughout that whole space, there's no fully functioning state. All the states have partially collapsed. What is taking place within that space, and of course also within Libya and also within Yemen, what is taking place is a kind of war or wars of succession. War among the ruins, to put it maybe more poetically, in which political/military organizations, very often organized on religious sectarian grounds or ethnic or sometimes tribal basis also, are fighting it out for supremacy in the confused space in question. Now here's the interesting point to note. These organizations, or those of them that are doing well at least, are for the most part not fully independent. They are rather supported by this or that powerful regional state or combination of states. So the game of states, so to speak, in the Middle East today is about who can function most effectively within these confused spaces. The one that can function most effectively will be the one that will build his strategic or its strategic power in the region. So this is a crucial competition which is taking place, and as we shall see, it is a competition also of profound importance for Israel's security. We'll go on to see, many of you probably already know why, but we'll go on to see exactly why that and how that works. So what I'd like to now do is to ask the question, who are the states or combination of states which are operating in this field, and who's winning and who's losing in this confused space which is the Middle East, the broken, fragmented Middle East of 2019. And I'm going to look at, I guess, 3 or maybe 4 blocks or alliances, and then I'm going to touch also on the role, or in doing that I'm going to touch on the role of superpowers in this space, specifically United States and also Russia. To begin then, let me say the following. Very clearly the most effective and clearly crystallized and well-organized bloc operating in this space is the constellation or bloc led by the Islamic Republic of Iran. Note that I don't say it's necessarily the strongest. It certainly isn't some unstoppable juggernaut or something like that. The Iranians are weak and vulnerable in all kinds of ways, but for reasons we'll see in a moment, they are exceptionally good at operating within the kind of space I was describing a few minutes ago. Why so? The answer as to Iranian success, well, before I get to that, let's just remember who is in the Iran-led regional bloc. Islamic Republic of Iran itself, of course, Hezbollah, which dominates Lebanon, the Assad regime in Syria, the Shia militias or popular mobilization units, Hashd al-Sha'bi in Arabic, in Iraq, the Ansar Allah movement, or Houthis as they're more commonly known in Yemen, and the Islamic Jihad movement among the Palestinians. Not Hamas, by the way. Hamas has its relations with Iran, but it would be wrong to characterize it as an integral member of Iran-led regional bloc. Now, what explains the success of this bloc in the confused space of the Middle East over the last decade? I would argue the explanation is organizational in nature, and we need to understand something about the nature of Islamic Republic of Iran to get it. Iran is, by its own self-definition, a revolutionary state, right? We know that the regime came into power as a result of Islamic Revolution of 1979. This claim is not merely a conceit, right? It's not merely verbiage to say they are a revolutionary state. It's not just the story that the state tells about itself. It has real organizational and behavioral expression, specifically in the shape of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, and even yet more specifically in the shape of the Quds Force, which is the expeditionary force of the Revolutionary Guards Corps. Iran possesses a group of people, or we don't have to be PC because we're talking about Iran, it's a group of men, since there are no women in the organization, whose specific skill set is the raising up or fomenting of revolution and subversion in countries neighboring Iran for the purpose of what? Well, for the purpose of the global Islamic revolution, if you ask Iran itself, or to put it more prosaically, for the purpose of advancing the interests of the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is the skill set of that organization. It's a very strange kind of organization. Most states don't have such a body. The Netherlands certainly doesn't. Israel also doesn't. United States also doesn't. This is not an intelligence agency, though it can function as both an intelligence and a counterintelligence agency when required. It's not a military or paramilitary force, but it can be those things too. But it is a group of people whose specific skill set is the creation and raising up and utilization of proxy political and military forces in neighboring countries to help the interests of Islamic Republic of Iran. Now here's the thing. When times are good and states are stable, and they have those stable defense structures associated with states, the possession by a state of an organization committed to fomenting of revolution among the neighbors might be little more than a conceit, a decoration, just a thing that the state says about itself. And many of us here, I think, are old enough to remember the old Soviet Union, and we remember the fact that up until the moment of its demise, the Soviet Union regarded itself as not simply a state, but rather the center of a global revolutionary movement. I grew up in the 1980s. By the 1980s, that notion had become largely a joke in the case of the Soviet Union. Of course, in the 1930s and 40s, it was not a joke, but it had that expression. Now, here's the thing. With the Revolutionary Guards Corps, indeed, when they've tried to get organized in well-organized states, relatively well-organized, we're talking about the Middle East, don't forget, but United Arab Emirates, eastern province of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and so on, they tend to get picked up very quickly and sent home. If they're lucky, they get sent home. If not, something else. Yeah. But here's the key. Here's the crucial point. In a situation like the one I was describing a moment ago, in which state authority has collapsed or fragmented across a broad swathe of the region, and a war of succession has taken place of the kind I described a moment ago, the possession by a state of a group of people whose specific skill set is the recruiting and creation and utilization of proxy political and military forces will be worth its weight in gold to the state that possesses such a body. Iran possesses such a body. No other regional state does, and this organizational fact, I would suggest, more than any other single factor, is responsible for the success and advancement of Iran across the ruined Middle East in the course of the last decade. Now let me take that down from 30,000 feet in the sky, so to speak, to a specific and concrete example. And the example I want to take is from Syria, a country which I've been watching quite closely over the last 7 or 8 years. In 2012, the Assad regime in Syria was facing the possibility of, or the near certainty, in fact, of violent dissolution. It was going to fall against the efforts and blows of the insurgency raised against it in March 2011. Why was that going to happen? Because the Assad regime had a built-in structural flaw which it couldn't by itself solve or resolve. And that flaw was it had a lack of sufficient, available and loyal manpower. To put it bluntly, not enough people were willing to take a bullet for the Assad regime. And that was built in. It wasn't just because their PR wasn't good enough and they hadn't managed to attract sufficient numbers of enthusiastic young people. It was built into the nature of Assad regime. Why? Because the Assad regime rests on a very narrow pillar of sectarian support. People, I think, here probably know this. The Assads themselves come from a sect called the Alawis. It's a split off from Shia Islam. The Alawis are about 12% of the Syrian population. The insurgency raised against Assad was based on the Sunni Arab majority in Syria. The Sunni Arabs are around 60% of the Syrian population. So the rebels just had more, an almost limitless pool at that time of young people willing to fight their cause, and the regime was desperately short of manpower. Now here's the thing, here's what happened. Why did the regime nevertheless not fall? Not because of any native ability of the regime itself, but because the regime is aligned, of course, with Iran. And the Iranians looked at the problem and said, we understand, you have a shortage of manpower, we're going to solve that for you. And how did the Iranians solve it? The Iranians mobilized proxy forces from across the region, from Lebanon and Iraq, which of course border Syria, but also from as far afield as Afghanistan and Pakistan. Okay, raised up militiamen, recruited them, clothed them, trained them, armed them, transported them, deployed them in Syria, on the plains of northern Syria, and saved the day for Assad and held the rebels off and fought them back. Now this was an astonishing achievement. It was an astonishing achievement just logistically, as I think we can all appreciate. The notion of bringing tens of thousands of, of men from across the corners of the world, so to speak, or at least of the East and Asia, and bringing them to one country is something. But politically also was an astonishing achievement. To have these young men available and willing to join, and willing to take risks, and willing to give their lives if necessary. On lots of different bases, by the way. The poor Afghans who joined the Fatemiyun militia were mainly Shia refugees from the Hazara Shias of Afghanistan, and they who were resident in Iran, and they joined for $150 a month, and because if they were killed, their families would be allowed to live in Iran. So this is poor, sad, unfortunates, going up to the top level of Lebanese Hezbollah, who have some very skilled and committed fighters indeed. But at the end of the day, these were guys who signed up, and Iran was able to organize them, bring them to Syria, and make them perform effectively. It's an astonishing achievement. We know it's an astonishing achievement because we have a parallel example taking place coterminously, taking place at the same time, of how not to do it. Right? Because at the same time that the Assads and the Revolutionary Guard were mobilizing for the Assads, this Shia gathering, which saved the day for Assad, the Sunni states, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, were trying to do a similar thing on the other side for the rebellion. And all they were producing was an unholy, god-awful mess. And the reason I know that is because I witnessed it from close up, as did every other journalist who was working the Turkish-Syrian border at that time, entering the rebel areas and getting out again. And what we witnessed was a kind of absurd free market, effectively, in a situation. Free markets usually work, but not in this particular situation, they didn't. A free market of a situation in which representatives of states, Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and of movements, the Muslim Brotherhood as well, would make their way to southern Turkey, establish themselves in some of the hotels, quite nice hotels, some of them, by the way. I don't recommend a holiday in something, that's another thing. In Antakya and Hatta and these places, establish themselves in the hotel, and representatives of various rebel movements would cross the border, meet these guys, and try to sell their wares, sometimes with, memory sticks with video on it of, look, this is our guys, look at this bomb that we made, look how strong we are, give us your money, don't give any money to the idiots in the next village, they're completely hopeless, but we are going to bring down Bashar Assad. Well, the result was, as you might expect, a crisscrossing, confused line of financial support to various groups of local rebels who, unsurprisingly, very rapidly became hugely corrupt. And of course, the quick emergence of warlords, often from men who were very simple people beforehand, just building workers or painter and decorators, suddenly commanding hundreds of men and smuggling material this way and that and putting money aside in bank accounts. In short, absolute chaos. And of course, absolute failure, politically and militarily, which shows us that this is not an easy thing to do. And the fact that the Iranians do it so well is because they know what they're doing, and they've got a bunch of people who've been at it for 30 years. right? So thus far then with regard to the Iran-led regional bloc, they're not good at everything by any means, and we're seeing the way in which the United States campaign of maximum pressure on their economy is, you know, bringing them to huge difficulties now, and we're seeing the way that more than 1,000 Israeli air sorties over the skies of Syria over the last 4 years demonstrate the fact that if you can turn the conversation, so to speak, from proxy and irregular warfare, which they do very well, to intelligence and air warfare, which they do rather badly, you can make them completely helpless very quickly, and Israel has done that in its own way. So they're not good at everything, but the thing that they're good at is very relevant to the moment, and the thing that they're good at, they are extremely good at. Thus far with regard to the Iran-led regional bloc. Now, it was customary among many analysts back in Israel at this stage in talks of this kind, up until recently at least, to say something like the following. There's an Iran-led regional bloc and it's very dangerous and it doesn't like us and it's a problem. But the good news is that there is also a counter-Iran bloc. There is a bloc or an alliance of moderate or pro-Western countries that have coalesced, joined together by common concerns about Iran and also maybe about Sunni political Islam. Regional countries are finding their way to one another to operate effectively. That sounds great. The only bad thing about it is that it's not true, at least not in my estimation, or at least we need to complicate the picture. It's not a stupid statement, but we need to complicate the picture. Let's understand why we need to complicate the picture, first of all, by noting the countries that are usually included in this supposed alliance of moderate or conservative or pro-Western states. Well, you would include Israel itself, of course, in the list. You would include the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, no doubt, United Arab Emirates, Morocco also, Jordan, Egypt, probably the Kurdish regional government of the Barzani family in northern Iraq. And if we were feeling particularly generous, we might even include the Palestinian National Authority in Ramallah of Mahmoud Abbas. So there we have a long list of these countries and forces. Now what's the obvious problem that we can already note with these countries and forces? The problem is it's a very long list of countries that don't appear immediately to have a great deal in common with one another. And indeed, that is the case. The list of countries, did we mention Morocco also? We should put Morocco in the list. The list of countries include absolute monarchies, democracies, religious theocracies, corrupt kleptocracies, I won't say which one is that, and you know, and a whole perhaps variety of other possible forms of organization. Now these don't work together as one hand and cannot work together as one hand in the way that Iran and its allies, of course, can, who are very cohesive and are organized and are united by similar ideas. And indeed, it's probably a more accurate, if more prosaic, description of the group of countries I just listed to say this is a group of countries who sometimes agree with one another on important issues, and when they do, they work together very well, and sometimes don't agree with one another at all on an important issue, and then they can't work together at all. That doesn't sound as impressive, but I think it's more empirically accurate. Quick examples of the two. In northern Sinai, there's a real and existing ISIS danger. There's a franchise of Islamic State down there which calls itself Wilayat al-Sina, the Sinai province of Islamic State. It used to be called Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis, which is a yet more interesting name for reasons I haven't got time to go into. But it sounds Bayt al-Maqdis, if you know Hebrew, Bayt al-Mikdash, right? This is the clue as to why it's an interesting name, but we won't get into that now. The point is this: it's around 1,000 fighters, and they're a danger. And they're a danger to Israel because they're close to the border in northern Sinai, and they're a major challenge to Egypt. And as a result of that joint challenge, today we have a situation of levels of cooperation between the Israeli and Egyptian security forces, which are literally without precedent, all the way back to the 1979 peace accord. We now know just from reading our media, not any secret information here, we now know it's not only about intelligence cooperation, which we've known about for a while, it's also even about Israeli air power being used and employed in support of Egyptian ground forces operating against ISIS. So it's very significant and important indeed. Here you have a clear commonality, a clear common security threat, which enables the countries in question, with all the separate problems that may exist between them, to work together very effectively. So far, so good, right? The alliance of the good people. But if we take a counter-example, and this counter-example is the case of Syria, and look at the way that two of the most important components, supposedly, of the alliance of moderates, Egypt again, and this time Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, look at the Syrian issue, we see straight away how this idea falls down very quickly. The Egyptians look at the Syrian war, and who do they support? What do they see? They see an authoritarian military regime, not altogether unlike themselves, yeah, fighting against an Islamist uprising, not altogether unlike the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who they're fighting against. So who do they support, or where do their sympathies lie? With the Assad regime, right? Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, they look at the situation in Syria. What do they see? They see an Iran-aligned regime, the Assad regime, and Iran is their main enemy and their main concern to the Saudis, yeah? An Iran-aligned regime fighting against a popular uprising. Who do they support? The uprising. Well, that's fine. Internal logic to both claims. But these are two members of this supposed alliance of moderates who, on one of the most important regional files of all, find themselves on opposite sides. Now, again, it's not the end of the world, but it's something very different to what you find among the Iranians and their friends, where such a situation would be completely unimaginable. Right? You would be summarily expelled, so to speak, from the Iranian alliance if you didn't get behind what the Iranians wanted you to get behind. And we know that because that's what happened to Hamas in the course of the Syrian civil war, for reasons we can get into. So this is not an alliance. It is a confused group of countries, all of whom share some common concerns, sometimes work together well, sometimes don't work together at all. What could make them into an alliance, and this moves me on to the third thing I want to discuss, the only thing which could draw those countries together into an alliance would, of course, be the leadership of the United States of America, with whom all of them, one way or another, are aligned and connected. Now, there was a situation which led to the optimism of some of my colleagues a year or so ago, a year and up to 2 years ago, when many people thought that the US was about to take on that role. Right? We remember when the Americans left the Iran nuclear deal, the reimposition of sanctions on Iran and so on and so forth, at the time when John Bolton specifically was National Security Advisor and Mattis was still there in defense, and this team seemed to be emerging who were of a similar mind to many of us in Israel with regard to the Iranian threat, and of course Trump himself at the top expressing those concerns. We thought that that may have been the way the wind was blowing. Now, in late 2019, I think it's possible to be clear that's not what's happening. What's happening is something much more complex. The Americans and the Trump administration are putting real and severe economic pressure on the Iranians, and that's something which is happening. Will it bring the Iranians to their knees or cause them to reverse direction? I think not, for reasons we can get into. But the important point to note is that the pressure from the United States, it appears, is going to be economic in nature only, which doesn't make it nothing. It's not nothing, but it's economic in nature only. President Trump, for maybe good reasons, maybe bad reasons, we can debate it, but at the end of the day, the American people elect their own president. It's their business, it's their army, they can do what they want with it. You know what I mean? It can't really come to with claims. Yeah? Maybe good reasons, maybe bad reasons. Maybe a combination of the two. The President Trump is determined and was elected in order not to get involved in new major involvements inland and upstream in the Middle East. The American people don't want that, not after Afghanistan, not after Iraq. They want to bring their soldiers home. There's hard strategic elements to this as well, by the way. If you look at the strategic debate in the US Armed Forces, there are many and persuasive voices in the US Navy, specifically, who say that all US security policy should be about the need to face the Chinese in East Asia, in the South China Sea, 25 or 30 years from now, and to have a Navy that can do that. And that's what America should be doing, and anything other than that is a diversion. Now, that's not nonsense. That's not idiocy. You don't have to agree with it, but it's not nonsense. So there's a combination of ideas which are causing this. This being the fact, as we saw over the summer, that the Iranians can carry out a series of provocations against American-aligned countries like UAE, which had its tankers attacked on 4 occasions, against America itself, which had a Global Hawk drone downed over the Gulf, and, of course, against Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which in the most dramatic development of all on September 14th, you know, a major oil processing plant, Abqaiq, and oil field, Khurais, was subject to a very effective and powerful raid with drones and cruise missiles, clearly from the Iranians. And here's the point. There's not been any response, and it doesn't necessarily look like there's going to be any response. And what this is causing American allies and American foes in the region to conclude is, okay, we kind of get the measure of this. There's going to be a certain amount of pressure economically on Iran. There's not going to be a military response. How are the various supposed members of this supposed bloc responding? They're responding in different ways, and in unsurprising ways. The weaker members of the bloc, who tend to be the ones closer to Iran, namely Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, are seeking to hedge their bets. Right? Understanding that the Americans are not behind them, they're seeking to try to make peace one way or another with Iran. Of course, in that situation, it will be in Iran's terms that you make peace. Example, and it's kind of a amusing one if you have this kind of sense of humor, I suppose. UAE had 4 of its tankers attacked. What was the response of the UAE? In, I think, late July, they sent a delegation from the Emirati Coast Guard to Iran, who had a meeting with their Iranian counterparts, and they reached a memorandum of understanding on security in the Gulf. You understand? Oh, it's like the mafia comes in and smashes your shop to pieces, yeah? And then says, let's have a meeting about keeping your shop secure, yeah? Something like that. So this is what's happening with the Gulf Arabs, and it's not surprising, which leaves Israel, which has no chance, of course, of hedging its bets with Iran, because they don't want to talk to us, but it's also in the happy situation of being vastly militarily stronger than either Emirates or Saudi Arabia, and capable, therefore, of defending itself. But it is Israel, to some degree, by itself right now, facing, so to speak, the advance of the Iranians across the confused space we were talking about. Thus far, then, with regard to the so-called moderate bloc. How long have I been talking, by the way? About half an 10 minutes, good. Very quickly, then, to look at a couple of other players, less important players. We've covered the most important ones. Had we been talking 7 or 8 years ago, I would have spent a great deal of time talking about Sunni political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood. And I would have said, and we probably would have agreed, this is the new and emergent force in the region. They're in power in Egypt. They may be in power soon in Syria. They're in power in Tunisia. They're in power in Turkey. They're still in power in Turkey, by the way. And they have the backing financially and propagandistically of Emirate of Qatar. This is an emerging new force. Not much of that, of course, is left. The army's back in power in Egypt. The Islamists are out of power in Tunisia. They're not coming to power anytime soon in Syria. So what we have left of that bloc, so to speak, is Turkey and Qatar, and I guess Hamas down in Gaza, if we want to complete the picture. So it's a much smaller bloc than we thought it was going to be, but we cannot look at the Middle East and understand it today without understanding the quite aggressive ambitions of the Republic of Turkey under Erdogan, and the fact, which I think we should note, that the Republic of Turkey that we knew for many decades is now in a process of transformation into something else entirely. I think that Turkey is on the way to transforming itself into a kind of Near Eastern version of Pakistan. That's to say, a country with a modern economy of sorts, but governed over by Islamist or Islamic political class and perceptions. Now, it's kind of astonishing, but this takes us into fields beyond my pay grade of the nature of human nature. It's kind of astonishing that somebody or a group of people could look at the EU, yeah, and look at Pakistan and say, you know something, I think we're going to go with the model of Pakistan. Right? I personally don't get it, but that's what the AKP in Turkey is doing. It's looking at Europe, it's looking at political Islam, and it's saying we prefer to take our country down the road of political Islam. What's taking place in Syria today with the Turkish invasion after October 9th, what's taking place in Iraq also, where the Turks have 15,000 troops, what's taking place in the Mediterranean, where the Turks are harassing Cypriot ships seeking to drill for gas around Cyprus, with the claim, absolutely unbased in international law, that the Turks also have rights because of the self-declared Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. And by the way, what's also taking place in Gaza and also taking place in Jerusalem, the city where I happen to be a resident, is that Turkey is busy trying to fan the flames of Sunni political Islam in a variety of ways, up to and including military support for Hamas, carried out in ways that are deniable, but we can talk in detail if you want. It's something I look at closely. This is a new and emergent challenge, and we need to be aware of it. And lastly, in terms of blocs active in the region, we can't complete the picture without remembering the Salafi jihadi movements, not states, but powerful transnational networks. Al-Qaeda core leadership, of course, and the thing that still calls itself Islamic State. Islamic State, of course, no longer a quasi-state, which it was in its moment of glory in summer of 2014, but still powerful insurgent networks, very bad at politics, but very good at military organization, and possessing still money and weaponry and networks and people, and most importantly, a mass of angry, disaffected young Arab Sunni Muslims who've come out losers from the last 10 years. Yeah, in Syria and in Lebanon and in Iraq, and maybe among the Palestinians too, and who will be therefore susceptible, some of them at least, to these kind of messages, I would say, in the period ahead. Lastly, just to note the influence of Russia in all this, as a result of the American pullback, as a result of the fragmentation and collapse, as a result of the subsequent wars, Russia has been able to reinsert itself back into the Eastern Mediterranean. We mentioned Iran at the beginning helping Assad, but of course the real turning point in the Syrian war was on September 30th, 2015, the day that Russian aircraft were first sighted over the skies of Syria, and that announced not only the survival of Assad, but it announced the birth of a new strategic moment in our region. After 40 years, the Russians were back. They are back. They're not going away anytime soon. What do they want? They want influence. They are currently the most powerful arbiter in Syria. They want to sell weapons to everybody, and they're selling weapons to Egypt, to Saudi Arabia, and maybe most importantly, to Turkey. And they want to, Putin also wants to be able to tell the people at home that, hey, look, Russia's back, we're a superpower again. But they want to do it at low cost. They want to do it without major commitments on the ground. They are there in any case, and they're not to be trifled with. I want to conclude, excuse me, I want to conclude, as I said I would, by asking what this means for Israel, this whole not simple picture that I've been trying to paint before you. And I'm going to focus on a specific file, because it's the one which I think is the key security threat to Israel today, and I'm not the only one, of course, by any means, who thinks that. And it's the following. As a result of the emergence of these collapsed and fragmented spaces which we discussed at the beginning, but specifically in the areas of Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, there is an ungoverned space stretching all the way between, well, Iran and the Mediterranean Sea, but for our purposes, Iran and the Israeli border, right, or two Israeli borders, the Israeli-Syrian border and Quneitra Crossing, and the Israeli-Lebanese border. Right? Iran, as you are all aware, has a strategic goal of the demise or destruction of Israel. That's a policy goal. And Iran has been engaged in the building of proxy militias with the intention of creating an infrastructure for building that all across that poorly governed space. Iran today dominates Lebanon through Hezbollah. It's close to domination of Iraq through the Shia militias. And in Syria, it's aligned with the Assad regime, and it's also building its own strength on the ground. So the intention of the Iranians is to build a contiguous space of power across which and on which they can then build a military infrastructure, most importantly missiles, and most importantly precision-guided missiles, but also guerrilla, irregular manpower that can be mobilized against Israel all along that space. Now, they've been busy building that over the last 3 years or so, 3 or 4 years or so, and Israel's been busy trying to degrade and destroy it. That's what's been happening with the raids into Syria. That's what's been happening with the raids into Lebanon. And of course, since the summer, as I'm sure many of you have noted, that's what happened with the broadening of the front for the Israeli Air Force into Iraq, with at least 4 or 5 raids carried out by Israel on Iraqi soil. That's what all this is about. I want to conclude by asking, how are we doing? What's the state of play, so to speak, in terms of this? Who's winning and who's losing? Many Israeli professionals and people within the defense structures would say, actually, we're doing pretty good. And there's a reason why they would say that. They'd say, look, if you look at the tangible physical evidence of Iranian infrastructural development of this threat, particularly in Syria, also in Iraq, they've tried to build it, we've destroyed a whole lot of it. And that's true. Right? They're not there with a Hezbollah-like structure in Syria yet, because Israel has simply physically stepped in and destroyed a great deal of it. That's true. Insofar as that's the case, we're doing pretty well. Right? The immediate threat has been blunted. Looking more deeply, however, in terms of the longer-term developments in those countries, Iran is slowly building towards full spectrum domination of Lebanon and of Iraq and of Syria, with the intention of turning those countries into instruments, long term, 5, 10, 15 years down the line, for future action against Israel. And that's something which Israel by itself will have difficulty defeating. We can perhaps deter it, but defeating it will be difficult. So right now, and I'll conclude with this, as a result of the collapse and fragmentation and change, which is still very much underway in the Middle East, there has emerged for Israel new challenges to take the place of the old ones. We're still in the midst of those challenges. For various reasons we can go into, I do not regard, and my colleagues do not regard, those challenges as existential. They're not existential challenges at this point. If Iran gets nuclear power, they'll become existential. But they certainly are very, very complex and serious, and they look set to engage the energies, so to speak, of a younger generation of Israelis and Jews currently taking up position in these areas. So on that note, I'll be happy to stop talking and to take questions and contributions. Thank you very much.
Hij doet het niet. Hij doet het toch niet, dat is jammer. Jonathan, if you could, do you have the other one? Which?
I gave it back.
Just a minute. I want to see some questions. 1, 2. We'll take 3, 4 questions, and then. Oh, Jonathan, is that a good idea? That we'll take a few questions and then. Okay. And by the way, can I ask anybody to get Jonathan a glass of water, please? Oh, you do? Okay. Okay. The question was here? Please, no, I hold the mic.
Okay. Jonathan? My name is Ruben Kramer. Thank you very much for your very clear explanation. I have a question from a strategic point. You said the Russians are back in town. They want to have their military bases. They want to have their naval bases in Latakia. On the other hand, you said Iran is trying and is working on a full, not only military, perhaps economic, but certain military influence there in the Middle East. Now, up till now, Russia has agreed that Israel is bombarding in Iraq and in Syria a lot of bases. On the other hand, the Russians see that Iran is getting stronger and stronger. Now, in your point of view, how far do you think that Russia will accept that Iran is strengthening and taking over in the Middle East?
Was nog een vraag hier?
My name is Job Roosenhart. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm here. What do you think about the nuclear threat until now for Iran? And the Europeans think differently than the Americans about that, that's for sure. But do you think, specialist, what is happening now, right now on the nuclear power of Iran?
There were 2 questions on the other side. One here.
My name is Bakil Ashkari. I'm Dutch Kurdish. I just came back from Erbil, Kurdistan. Yes? Yeah. Well, I was just 4 days for business. But I found out in the Iranian, you didn't mention about the Itlahat, the security service, which is absolutely in the Middle East and especially in Iraq is so influential. But now what's happening in Baghdad and in the south of Iraq, everybody is talking about, yeah, this is the Israelis and Americans are trying to do this. As long as Iran is not pushed back, the people there and also in the Middle East actually expecting that Iran will expand and also attack Israel. Why? Because what the American did in Syria, don't you think it's also a warning for Israel, because they pushed back, they left the Kurds in a lark, which is absolutely unacceptable. And everybody was talking about now the Americans are in Kurdistan, and they have cashed up, you know, just al-Baghdadi. Yeah. So my question is, what do we expect that there will be ever a stop, Iranian? I would say it will be worse.
And there was a question here, the last one for this round. Excuse me. Yes.
Thank you for your explanation. It was very interesting. I have one question for you. In the Lebanon, I read recently there is a complete economic collapse, and that it might affect Syria quite heavily. That's my question.
Here you are, Jonathan.
Okay, so now I have enough material for another talk for 45 minutes. Don't worry, I'm not going to inflict that upon you, but nevertheless. So first of all, with regard to Russia, yeah, fascinating question. How far will Russia accept, or for how long will Russia accept that Iran appears to be taking over the Middle East? I thought you were going to ask a slightly different question, which is the other side of that question, which would be, for how long will Russia accept that Israel's bombing Iran in Syria, right? Which is you know, the same question put the other way around. Yeah. Look, it's not simple. There is rivalry between the Russians and the Iranians in Syria. There's simple economic rivalry, i.e., okay, they both helped to save Assad. Now they both want to coin in, you know, to cash that in, so to speak, in terms of building harbors and building ports and getting contracts for rebuilding the electricity grid and getting contracts for potash mining and all the other opportunities and getting their hands on the oil and gas of the Jazeera, you know, east of the Euphrates and so on. So there's rivalry in that regard. There's a more interesting and deeper rivalry as well, which is that the Iranian and Russian projects in Syria are very different and even contradictory. In what sense? The Russians like strong states, right? Russia likes having strong state structures to work with. So it likes to strengthen the state structures of its allies and then work with a strong state. That's what it's trying to do in Syria. And of course, Russia has a long history with Syria, going back to 1963. The then Soviets have been aligned with the Ba'athi regime in Syria. The Iranians like something quite different. The Iranians like weak states to be aligned with. The Iranians want their allies to have a weak state structure, and then the Iranians themselves will build a strong parallel structure that they control, which will help the ally. You get into trouble, the structure will help you, but the Iranians will control the structure. You won't control it. Now, these are contradictory projects in Syria. The Iranians are trying to hollow out and weaken the state and replace it with themselves. The Russians are trying to build it up. And this does lead to clashes, and there have been clashes, including physical clashes, between different elements of the Syrian security forces, those that work with Russia, indeed that Russia created, like the 5th Assault Corps, and those that work with the Iranians, like Maher Assad's famously 4th Armored Division. They clash with each other. How long will this, or where is this heading? The question from an Israeli point of view is, could it head towards real confrontation? The answer, I think, unfortunately, is it probably won't. What will happen is that the Russians will ring-fence their own essential interests in Syria and say nobody should come anywhere near this. Everything else, which is less important to them, okay, never mind. Do we really need to control the highway from Abu Kamal to Mayadin up the Euphrates River? No, if the Iranians want to control it, let them control it. We would rather that Assad, we the Russians, would rather that Assad controlled it. But if not, are we going to go to war about it? No, we're not going to. So I think the answer is that, you know, the Russians are not in favor of the Iranian takeover of the Middle East. The Russians are nowhere a partner to any of this. But is Russia a force which we can kind of rely on to be the Russians will stop this? No, they won't. Including, and we even have, in Israel, we have already a control experiment to prove this. If you remember last summer, the Assad regime came back to Dara and Quneitra provinces in the southwest facing Israel, yeah? And much of the Israeli media coverage said, don't worry, it's okay, because we have a deal with the Russians. They're going to keep the Iranians some people said 60 kilometers, some people said 80 kilometers. By the way, that takes you all the way to Damascus, so that was a bit optimistic. Some people said 40 kilometers, we're going to keep the Iranians back, yeah? It was all nonsense. We're looking at this very closely. The Iranians are all the way to the border. The Iranians are 300 meters away from Quneitra crossing, right? You can check it. There's maps already, yeah? So the Russians are simply not going to do this for us. It's not going to work. So that's the answer. Yes, there are contradictions, but in my view at least, these contradictions will not come to a head, as the expression would be. Yeah, they'll just carry on being contradictions, and that's where we'll be left. With regard to the nuclear threat, well, as we're all reading in our newspapers, the Iranian response to the American exit from the deal, among other things, is the intention of slowly and incrementally themselves exiting from the deal, up to and now including, of course, the operation of centrifuges in Fordow, in direct contravention of the deal. So what does this mean? I think it means that slowly the Iranians, are going to depart from the JCPOA. The notion that they are going to continue implementing it when America is outside of it, I think is proving less and less realistic, especially when they are finding that they haven't got partners in Europe for the circumvention of US sanctions, right? The notion which they had initially that, well, the Europeans will help us to get round the sanctions, and then that's the way we'll kind of show the Americans that they're isolated and we're not isolated. It's not working. And so the alternative strategy to that is defiance. And defiance will include a return slowly and incrementally to the nuclear program itself. Having said that, my own sense at least is that the prospect of a quick Iranian rush towards the bomb, I think, is not what the Iranians are going to do. They're not reckless in that regard. They're doing pretty well in other areas. They don't want to provoke the Americans into an unavoidable response. So I think they'll keep it on the slow burner for now. It's a strategic goal of Islamic Republic of Iran to have nuclear weapons, make no mistake about it. But it's not something which I think is on the absolute top of their agenda right now. They're busy with the regional contest, and that, I think, is what the prospect which we have for the immediate period looking forward. Just to be clear, to give an example of why I'm confident to say this, it's clear now that the Iranians, even when they hit at America, do so in a very calibrated way. I think they've figured out that with Trump in the White House, you can destroy American property, you can kill American allies, you mustn't kill Americans. And they try very hard not to. And I think they've kind of got the gauge. They get that Trump's not terrified of them. If they start killing American citizens, he'll come down hard on them. But much less than that, you can kind of get away with. So I think they're busy. That shows me, at least, they're not looking for confrontation. And that means they're not likely to sort of rush for a nuclear capability in the next 6 months. They're busy, slowly building up their strength. And that's, I think, the nature of the current situation. Fascinating question from you, sir. Yeah, with regard, well, two questions, really. You mentioned the issue of security services and the role of security services. Yeah, I didn't mention it because we're, in a sense, building a picture in broad strokes. But I'm happy to note the point, of course, that the role of Iranian and, by the way, Turkish intelligence with regard specifically to northern Iraq is massive. And anybody who goes to Erbil or conversely to Slemania and is not aware of the fact of this should be aware of it very quickly. These are poorly governed states in which the thoroughly penetrated by the intelligence services of neighbouring countries, and this is something very real. It's not just some notional verbiage. It means that information structures helping the Iranians buried deep among the very large Iranian immigrant guest worker population in Iraqi Kurdistan. Many of them Iranian Kurds, many of them also not Iranian Kurds, Iranian non-Kurds, who are there and who are providing information for the regime, not necessarily because they support the regime, but because their families are still living back in Iran, and they have a talk on the border with a representative of IRGC who tells them what they have to do and what not to do. These kind of structures are very, very real, and for anybody working in the Middle East, to not be aware of them can seriously damage your health, as they used to say in the cigarette packets back in England when I was a kid. With regard to the riots and very interesting point you raised, this notion, I follow it closely also in the Arabic press, this notion that Israel and America are behind the riots in Iraq. And indeed, it's even more interesting than that. The claim which also the Iraqi government and the media are saying is that, yes, somebody's shooting demonstrators, right? And of course, this is clear because 500 demonstrators have been killed in Iraq so far. Somebody's shooting demonstrators, but the government doesn't know who it is. It's not the government. They're not doing it. It's not the security services. So who could it be? There's a phrase they have in Arabic, mundisun. It means provocateurs. They say it's mundisun are doing it. Some strange third force is appearing on the streets. And of course, who is controlling these mundisun who are randomly appearing on the streets of Baghdad and killing demonstrators? America and Israel. No doubt about it. Yeah, well, hey, you know, forgive me, but there is a slightly more prosaic explanation for this, which is that, of course, parallel to the Iraqi security services, there's a very strong and powerful Iran-supported Shia militia force, and hey, we happen to have reporters down there in Baghdad reporting to us who are talking to demonstrators who are saying, yes, of course, it's the militias. The militias are the ones who are killing demonstrators with live ammunition under the orders of an Iranian power structure from the very first day. It's another example, this time more granular than in my initial talk, of the way in which Iran operates power so effectively and so clandestinely and so in such an irregular way on the streets of an Arab capital city. So that's why I think with regard to the questions, let's have another round. Oh, sorry, the back. Yeah, please.
There was one question about Lebanon. Take a sip first.
Thank you. Yeah. Lebanon, you're right. Well, yes, first of all, there is a very severe financial crisis in Lebanon, indeed. And of course, this is what provoked the demonstrations and riots, which began in Lebanon in mid-October. Specifically, then it was the issue, well, the media said it was about internet phone services, right, WhatsApp, and also it was about rise of tobacco tax. But the point is that, yeah, what it reveals is that Lebanon is in a country in very deep and severe financial crisis with an enormous national debt, with very high unemployment, and looking down the wrong end of a necessary IMF reform package. And as we know, when the IMF come in to reform your economy, they reform your economy, but it's brutal medicine, which requires usually, you know, drastic removal of subsidies and raising of prices and so on. So yes, Lebanon, the Lebanese financial situation is economy is in an absolute mess. It's not going to be resolved anytime soon. And it's important also because Saad Hariri, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, resigned in the face of the riots. And the riots were a product of the economic crisis. But this does not have only economic implications. It has also implications for the Iranian power structure. How do I jump to that? Well, you probably know already how. Because, of course, Hezbollah is the real ruler in Lebanon. But for Hezbollah to attract international investment and have to have some hope of managing the economy without catastrophe, it needs to have non-Hezbollah people notionally in power, right? Nobody's going to invest in the Hezbollah government. You have to be able to produce some nice, smiling Saad Hariri types to attract international capital. But Hariri has resigned, and Hariri, even though he may take up the position again, is insisting on something which Hezbollah will not grant, which is a government of technocrats, a government of experts, right? He's refusing that right now. So right now, Hezbollah is facing a real problem, Hezbollah and Iran. Namely, they may end up having to actually run Lebanon themselves. Lebanon is an economic basket case. They're the last people in the world who can get it out of that. And here's the fascinating thing. They have powerful friends, right? We were talking earlier, the Iranians, the Revolutionary Guards, Qasem Soleimani, Assad. None of these guys have any money. None of them have any money. They're good at other stuff. They haven't got, and what's more, they don't care about money. They have no idea how to respond to economic issues. It's the last thing they've ever thought about. So in this respect, and this goes back, I think, to a point which the United States administration deserves credit for. This is a way, if we trace all the way what this traces back to, it traces back to the Trump administration's campaign of economic pressure on Iran, right? That's what actually triggered all this stuff. So it's good and it's important. It's still playing itself out. It's not going to resolve itself anytime soon, and it may well be because Hezbollah is a fairly sophisticated organization and because Saad Hariri is a deeply corrupt figure, as is the rest of the Lebanese political class. You know, it may well be that they managed to cobble something together and avoid catastrophe. But undoubtedly, this has been a very serious blow to them. Just to finish on this point, to get the news reports accurate, so to speak, unlike in Iraq, but like in Iran, the demonstrations are already dying down in Lebanon, right? And as they're smaller numbers, there's still smaller and smaller numbers attending them. So there's not the kind of white-hot pressure on the political system in Lebanon right now, there was a month ago, which there still is in Iraq. So this is just something to also be aware of.
More questions. 1, 2. We'll take less questions now, so people can follow the answers.
Yes. We're talking about the danger of war. Okay. About the danger of war. Suppose. Moet ik hem vast? Okay, the danger of war. If Hezbollah is launching rockets at Israel, how long will Israel react quietly and not start to think, fuck the hell, every time it's the Lebanese, but the Iranians are behind it, we're going to hit Iran. They cannot do it alone, because Israeli fighter planes flying to Tehran or Natanz or Basra cannot fly back. The range is not long enough. So they need a lot of logistical support from the Americans for refueling in the air, because no Arab country is going to allow them on their soil to refuel there. How do you look at that?
Maybe you should repeat the question. I'm not sure everybody heard the question? No, so maybe you repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question was with regard to Israel versus Iran, so to speak. If Hezbollah continues to launch rockets, if I understood the question correctly, will Israel only respond with regard to Hezbollah, or will Israel say to itself, look, this is actually, Iran is the puppet master here, so actually we should be responding against Iran? And then the technical difficulties therein. First of all, I think I agree. That's to say, I think that what we hear in Israel, what one hears in Israel more and more, is the notion that if there is a war with Hezbollah again, it won't be confined only to Lebanon itself, because it becomes an absurdity at a certain point if the Iranians are permitted to sort of hold up these proxy organizations and say, well, no, it's not us, it's these people over there. And it encourages them, so to speak, because the Iranians can always feel safe. And the Iranians don't really care about Arabs, and you can kill as many Arabs as you want in their book, and it won't upset them. But if you start killing Iranians, it'll be a different equation. So the answer is yes. I think it is likely. Let me put it the other way around. I think it's unlikely that we'll have another round with Hezbollah that in any way resembles the war of 2006. But that's not only to do with the Israeli side. It's also to do with Hezbollah and Iran. At the end of the day, Hezbollah is an instrument that was created by Iran for a particular purpose, namely to serve the interests of Iran, and specifically, I think now, to serve the interests of the Iranian nuclear program. That's what those 130,000 rockets are there for, pointing at Israeli population centers. They're not there to be wasted in a contest with the Israeli Air Force, in which they get to hit some Israeli cities, but Lebanon's reduced to a smoking ruin. They're there, I think, and many others think too, for a potential future response to a strike at the Iranian nuclear facilities. Right? That's why I think that deterrent, so to speak, is there. They're meant to deter it or to respond to it if necessary. That, I think, is not anywhere close. So I don't think we're going to be, looking at going to war in that way anytime soon. But if it happens, then yes, then Israeli aircraft, or perhaps a combination of Israeli and American aircraft, will have to face the technical questions therein. I'm not an air warfare person, so I don't want to pretend to be able to answer those questions. But I also don't want to conclude without noting another scenario. In a certain sense, what I just said is if everything goes according to plan in everybody's book, right? In other words, we won't hit them until they go nuclear, and then if we hit them, then they'll respond, and everyone will work according to their book. Often wars don't start that way. Sometimes they do, but often they don't. Often they start because something goes wrong and sparks the war, and then things deteriorate very rapidly. Look, we've been hitting the Iranians and their friends in Syria very hard over the last 4 years. More than 1,000 air attacks. At least tens of Iranians killed and hundreds of non-Iranian, pro-Iranian Arab personnel killed. That's what's been happening. It's a very serious thing. And the Iranian attempts at response so far have been perfunctory, have been symbolic, basically. That doesn't mean that will always be the case. They hit the Saudis very hard on September 14th, and they displayed on September 14th knowledge and abilities which I'm not entirely convinced that the system in Israel knew they had. Maybe the system did know. Certainly everybody outside the system had no idea. And I'm not quite convinced that even the system knew that they could do that stuff with drones and cruise missiles as well as they did with the Saudis. Now, we're not the Saudis. We're a lot stronger than the Saudis. But if they were to respond like that, if they were to try to do an Abqaiq and Khureis type raid on us, on an important installation, and people were to be killed, they'd need to think very carefully before doing that, because our calculus at that point might be to respond very, very strongly. And then we might be into a deterioration. The 2006 war, which of course is miniature compared to any of the stuff we're talking about now, but the 2006 war started like that. It started because Nasrallah thought, okay, we'll ambush a patrol, we'll kidnap a couple of soldiers, we'll kill some others, and then the Israelis will respond proportionately. Yeah? And Olmert chose not to do that, but to say, okay, enough is enough, we're going forward now to try to destroy this and change the whole rules of the game. Nasrallah miscalculated the likely Israeli response. That happened then, not in miniature, because hundreds of days is not miniature, but relatively on a small scale. It could happen the same dynamic on a much, much larger scale, and that's something else to be aware of.
Are you okay?
Yes. My name is Arnold Jullenhoed. There are three important players in the Middle East, besides Iran. It's Israel, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. Now, with these three countries having a common enemy, can you shine your light on to what extent there is cooperation between those three countries?
Good. So Israel and Saudi Arabia, let me consider those two first, because Turkey is another discussion, I think. Israel and Saudi Arabia do have deep levels of cooperation, very clearly. It's no longer a deep secret or something of the state. Everyone knows about it. Also in terms of shared intelligence. Also maybe in terms of airspace. We don't know about that, but maybe that's been used also. And also, by the way, in terms of the private sector. And you won't be surprised to know, if you don't already know, that the boldest of a pretty bold bunch, which is Israeli entrepreneurs, the boldest of that bunch are already making their way down to the Gulf, also to Saudi Arabia, also to United Arab Emirates, and are benefiting in all kinds of ways, which benefit them, of course, and their pockets, but also which benefit the Emiratis and Saudis, because these guys can do stuff in important fields which they themselves absolutely cannot do. So yes, there is an emergent relationship between Israel and Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and it's exemplified in the statements that have been made by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, openly now, with regard to Israel, and even to lesser Saudi officials, who've made remarks of a friendly nature, not only towards Israel, but even towards the Jewish people and Jewish national aspirations in Israel, which we'd never have imagined we would have been able to hear a few years ago. So Israel and Saudi Arabia is an encouraging story. It derives, I think, not only from, unsurprisingly, not only from human goodwill and nice stuff, but also from the fact that the Saudis are aware that they're facing a potential strategic and economic catastrophe if they don't wean their economy away from reliance on petrochemicals over the next 20, 30 years, or maybe less. That's what Vision 2030 of MBS is all about. Israel has a role in that, right? The Saudis simply cannot afford anymore to be the Saudi Arabia we remember from the 1980s that was relying on an American security umbrella and at the same time pumping millions and millions of dollars into the poisoning of minds of Muslim generations across the region and also in the West, including also in the Netherlands. Right? That Saudi Arabia just is no longer economically sustainable, and the fact that a person like Mohammed bin Salman has emerged is ultimately a response to that, rather than just an outbreak of common sense. But nevertheless, which one should never rely on, of course, but nevertheless, it's good. All right? It's good from Israel's point of view, and it's real, and it's happening. Having said that, if I can put a small caveat, we have a problem, because we've got new friends emerging in the region, but all our friends are weak. All the weakest countries in the region want to be friends with us now. United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, these fragile countries that have existed behind an iron American wall, for the best part of the last half century. Now they've decided they want to be friends with us. It's good. I'm not being flippant. It's nice. It's fine. But the problem comes with the second part of your question, right? The strong and powerful and potent countries in the region don't want to be our friends at all. They want to be enemies. Iran we've already talked about. The other member of that category, I'm afraid to say, is the Republic of Turkey. Right? We were good friends with the Turks back in the 90s. I remember in my very brief foray into public service and the civil service in Israel in the late 90s, I was a junior press officer at the government press office in the late 90s. And I remember the first Israeli-Turkish naval exercise in the Mediterranean, Operation Reliant Mermaid it was called, back in 1998. I'm not quite sure what mermaids had to do with it, but it was 3 big Turkish ships arrived at Haifa port, and we were excited. And I remember standing on the in that sort of dramatic way that young people have. I was quite young then, in my late 20s. I remember standing on the Haifa port, on the harbour there with Turkish journalists, and we got cigars out as the Turkish ships, we saw them beginning to approach, and we said, we're witnessing the birth of a new strategic moment in the Middle East, the Israeli-Turkish strategic alliance. Very nice, 1998, very exciting, everyone was very deeply moved. Yeah, 4 years later, Erdogan was elected prime minister in Turkey, and the rest is history. What remains of the Israeli strategic partnership? Nothing is what remains of it. Again, complex picture. What remains of the economic partnership? Quite a bit. Actually, trade has increased between Israel and Erdogan's Turkey over the last 10 years. Why? The Turks produce goods, right? In the Gulf, they don't produce any goods, but they got lots of money, so they want to buy the goods. The Turks need to get the stuff down from Turkey to Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. They used to run it through Syria and Iraq. Yeah, but you couldn't really do that over the last 10 years for reasons we've already gone into, right? So how did they do it? What's the alternative route? They brought it to Haifa port. Then they took it down through Israel, Jordan, and into Saudi Arabia. So Haifa port's been doing a roaring trade in Turkish export goods, right, for over the last 10 years. But the problem is, alongside that, has been an absolute deterioration to stone cold in the strategic relationship. No more Israeli weapons, no more Heron drones, no more refurbishing of Turkish M60 Patton tanks that we used to do. All that stuff is dead. And we know now, if you talk to Turkish intelligence, if you talk to Hakan Fidan, you're probably talking to the Iranian Revolutionary Guards too, because he talks very regularly to them. Yeah, so it's as bad as it could be with regard to Turkey, and much worse than many people understand it to be with regard to Israel's relationship with Turkey. And it's something very worrying, especially, and I'll just finish on this, especially because of the Turkish ambitions in the Eastern Mediterranean. Right? They're keen to send warships to defend their illegal drilling off of Cyprus. They've already said they'll challenge militarily anybody who wants to object to it. The whole world objects to it. It's illegal. Right? But who are the only ones, not the only ones, but who among the various countries who have an interest in gas in the Eastern Mediterranean have a serious navy? Actually, Israel is the only one that does. So I leave you with that thought.
One more question. Also a question over there.
Hello, Jonathan. My name is Frans Visser. You painted, let's say, a story how Iran, develops its proxies across the Middle East, and that Israel is actually attacking, let's say, or trying to demise that. But is there any reason or any chance that we can cut the head off the snake, so to speak, to eradicate this whole structure, so to speak?
The Iranian regime is vulnerable, and as we've seen in the course of the last month, the most serious internal unrest has just taken place in Iran. Some gauges would say since the revolution of '79. It's very, very serious indeed. The sanctions are working in that respect. Can we help that along? I'd like to think that we could. And when I say us, I don't only mean Israel, but I mean also the West, and specifically the United States, in terms of the kind of covert action that can make that stuff worse and more troublesome than it otherwise might be. With the various boxes of tricks that can help with that, in terms of providing demonstrators with GPS systems and with communication systems and enabling them to keep, communicating without the regime knowing. All that stuff is doable. I hope very much, and I think very much, that we should be investing in that. It's not, of course, a exact science, nor is it in any way a certainty. The Islamic regime in Iran is strong. Let's not forget they still have certain percentage of support in the country. Maybe it's not more than 50%. I think it's much less than 50%. But what it is very determined. It's people who have, one, enriched themselves enormously as a result of the Islamic Revolution. And secondly, don't forget, they also kind of believed in it also when they made it. They knew, and thirdly, means they knew what they're doing. They know about revolution. They know about revolution because they made a revolution themselves back in '79. So they know how to defend also against someone else trying to replace them. So it's a very, very tough nut to crack. I'm not sure because it's not an exact science, but I do believe we can do a great deal in that regard to keep the Iranians occupied. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever why the Iranians should be able to raise fires all the way across the region, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, all the way down to the Gulf, and not have somebody else raising fires back home in their backyard. It's doable, and we should be doing it, and there should be, I hope to see more and more evidence of it in the period ahead.
Well, there are many people who have questions. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for your talk. You already have mentioned the name Major General Qasem Soleimani, and there are some analysts who have said that Qasem Soleimani is one of the favorites of the Ayatollah and that he could run for president after Rouhani. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would tend to think that Qasem Soleimani won't run for president because he doesn't need to be president. Qasem Soleimani is already exponentially more powerful than President Rouhani, right? The whole nature of his power and influence across the region has been built through informal channels and not formal channels. And one of the things I think which many of us in the West find hard to understand or are only starting to begin to understand is that Iranian power exactly runs through informal channels. It's not that somebody has, is officer grade C and he salutes to officer grade B and we can find some hierarchy. This is not East Germany we're talking about. Yeah, it's the opposite of that. It's informal channels which enable it to be nimble and unseen and effective. And Qasem Soleimani, I think, exemplifies that. And I would imagine that the last thing he wants to do is to have formal structures of power. Let Rouhani and the so-called reformists or the so-called moderates have the formal position so that they can convince the West, or at least the gullible people in the West, no, actually Iran is moderate and no problem. And in the meantime, as I think you correctly note, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei listens first and foremost to Qasem Soleimani and the Quds Force, the Revolutionary Guard. And that's the real power structure, making the real decisions. And that, I suspect, will continue to be the case.
We talked a lot of big money. I'd like you to talk a little bit about small money, and this is the Kingdom of Jordan, and a direct neighbor of Israel. Could you elaborate a little about the threats from Jordan, or the threats in Jordan?
Sure, with pleasure. So again, with regard to noting that the Arab Spring, or at least the unrest which accompanied it, has not finished, we've also witnessed in recent weeks in Jordan quite significant internal unrest related to a nationwide teachers' strike that took place and a number of other indications. Jordan is in trouble economically. Right? Jordan also is subject to a quite harsh IMF reform package. In the past, in Jordan, there have been riots. You trigger riots when you raise fuel and bread prices. That's also happened again over the last couple of years. The king has had no choice. There's 1.2 million new people in Jordan, right? Maybe even more, but we know about we can say with confidence 1.2 million new people. They're all Syrians, Sunnis that came in the course of the last year. They are no longer living only in the camps. They were living, if you remember, Zatari camp up in the north. They're no longer, they've made their way down to Amman, where they're working for cheap prices and annoying the Jordanians, because of course pushing them out of jobs, all the usual stuff. So there's deep unrest with regard to that. There is a Jordanian middle class, an educated middle class. Unsurprisingly, not everybody in that Jordanian middle class understands why they should live under an absolute monarchical system forever and ever, amen. That produces tensions too. So there are all kinds of internal tensions in Jordan, which are leading, by the way, unfortunately from Israel's point of view, to a sort of demonstrative anger on the part of the Jordanian elite against Israel. Probably you all read in Israeli media recently that the Jordanians just conducted a military exercise which the king attended, which was supposed to depict a war against a neighbor to their immediate west. Right? Well, they only have one neighbor to their immediate west, so we know what they were talking about. Right? So they are absolutely creating a worrying atmospheric, if I can put it that way, with regard to Israel. And it's the way that the king tries to placate the dangers emerging, or challenges, not dangers, but challenges emerging from civil society. Now here's the reason, or here's a couple of reasons why I, at least for what it's worth, nevertheless, don't expect that there'll be major deterioration or major problems emerging from Jordan. There's a number of reasons. Firstly, the fact is that on the elite level, with regard to cooperation between the security forces and intelligence services and so on of both countries, everything which we hear is it's still very good. And it's still very good because the Jordanians have a clear and obvious interest in it being good. At the end of the day, they need Israel a great deal. A great deal in a way more than Israel needs them. Israel needs them too, or Israel at least needs the king to stay on his throne. Yeah, because anything that replaces him will be worse. But the king needs Israel for practical purposes, and those are still in place. It's not only the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas organizing from below, and after all, let's not forget, Jordan is a majority Palestinian country, and Amman, the capital city, by the way, is a Palestinian city. The non-Palestinians live outside of the cities. This is a Palestinian city, yeah? So it's not only them, it is also the Iranians. The Iranians are there, of course, on the Syrian-Iraqi border, which also borders Jordan. There's nothing they would like more than to build networks all the way across Jordan into the West Bank, where they can then hit at Israel. They've tried to do it in the past. They're trying to do it now. The fact that the Americans left 600 troops in eastern Syria, even after President Trump's latest declaration, people say it was because of Israeli requests. It's also because the Jordanians asked, right? They, no less than Israel, understand the Iranian danger emerging from the direction of Iraq. So for all those reasons, I think that nevertheless Jordan is like the Jordanian monarchy is likely to keep its alignments with the West and with Israel in spite of the demonstrative anger we hear. And lastly, and I'd say this is an important point to note as well, bear in mind the following. Yes, we know that Jordan is 70% Palestinian, 30% East Bank Bedouin. Here's the thing to remember. Both Palestinians and East Bank Bedouin are Arabic-speaking Sunni Muslims. Right? Now, that's a very, very important thing in Middle East in 2019. Much of what we've been discussing has been countries ripped apart because of the complex, mixed, sectarian nature of the population. Shia, Sunnis, and then, of course, Kurds, a different nation, Alawis in Syria, Druze also, and so on and so forth. Jordan's not like that. It's overwhelmingly Arabic-speaking Sunni Muslim. Don't forget that the king's wife, I'm afraid Queen Rania, is very unpopular in Jordan, but something to remember about Queen Rania, she is Palestinian, even though people don't like her, which means that the son, the heir to the throne, is half Palestinian. You see, which sounds maybe ridiculous to us, eh? But, you know, in terms of legitimacy, that also has purchase. So for all those reasons, I would say the king is likely, in spite of the problems, to remain in head of a stable kingdom relatively for the period ahead.
Last question from behind, and just a minute, and then we have to close. Oop, I'm sorry.
I would like to know what you hope to see from Europe and America, how to contain Turkey, the threat of Turkey in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean Sea.
No, that's it.
So the Europeans and the Americans, let's take it separately, because it's two very separate categories if we think about Turkey. First and foremost, from the United States point of view, my own view at least, is that Turkey is not a NATO member in good standing, and that there is no reason on earth why a country which issues threats, literally, whenever it's faced with adversity, including the threat to close down the Incirlik air base, there's no reason whatsoever why that should be the country which has, you know, the most important both NATO and United States Air Force bases in the Middle East. Not only because it's a question of, you know, giving them a sweet for being good kids or something, because this is not a stable spot from which those bases can be utilized when it's an unfriendly regime there. There are plenty of other places in the Eastern Mediterranean and even further east where those bases could be relocated to. I think that should come onto the agenda. I'm not saying that tomorrow morning America should say that should come onto the agenda. The Turks should be made aware that they're not the only ones that can rattle sabers and threaten. They can also be the subject of threats. Right? And this, I think, will do them the world of good, as one might say. Now, with regard to the Europeans, in a way, it's a similar thing. The Europeans, of course, don't have this kind of hard power issue so much facing vis-a-vis Turkey. What they do have is a situation in which they have effectively, at least as far as I can see it, have effectively been intimidated into silence by the threat from Erdogan of allowing a sort of armada of refugee boats, coming across the Mediterranean, heading towards Europe. I'm afraid that's a bluff that just has to be called. Erdogan has to be told, well, there won't be any more money for you to look after. If you're going to make these threats, then the money will leave, and you'll have to do whatever you need to do with regard to these refugees. And we will not be supporting invasions of northern Syria for you to then try to push these refugees into northern Syria, which is what he wants to do. On the contrary, we will be condemning any such move, and we will be increasing our support for your opponents, up to and including, for example, and we will be not abandoning our loyal allies in the Syrian Democratic Forces just because you made a phone call to the president and threatened an invasion. In other words, I think Turkey has been punching vastly above its weight on the regional stage over recent years, and largely that's been because of a result of a lack of pushback. I suspect that Turkish behaviour is now reaching a level of provocation whereby that's no longer going to be sustainable. And I look forward, if I may be frank, to the moment when Turkey begins to experience some pushback. And I suspect that the issue of the East Mediterranean, which is now the third time I've mentioned it, I think it's very important and insufficiently covered, the issue of maritime rivalries over natural gas exploration in the Eastern Mediterranean could well be the precipitating factor that begins to trigger some of this stuff, and I hope that it will be.
I apologize, we couldn't take all the questions, but I think Jonathan has worked very hard tonight. Thank you very much, Jonathan. And I think there is, if you can stay for tomorrow, we can organize the next, Ladies and gentlemen, as you may have heard, Israel is going on elections again. Note in your calendar, the 2nd of March is going to be elections in Israel, and we're going probably to organize something. You will be very welcome. Before we close this evening, I want to ask the chair of CIDI to say a few words. Ronnie?
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm very impressed about the knowledge. I just said you put in a dime and we get the information that we want to hear from you. Not only the way you speak, but your knowledge is incredible. And it was a long time since we had you here. And you told in the beginning of your speech that even a term of 3 months has changed your view and input of the situation. So I think that we cannot wait another couple of years to invite you again. But one thing I make sure, next time you come, at least you have this crowd again to be your audience. Thank you so much. Ja, vrienden, even in het Nederlands. Ik ga je niet lang ophouden. Aan het einde van het jaar, 10 dagen is het Chanukka en Kerst. Ik kan het leuk om op je vertellen over dat vliegtuig dat in New York landt, maar dat doe ik na afloop. Maar wat ik jullie wel onder de aandacht wil brengen is dat CIDI het nieuwe jaar ingaat met dezelfde commitment en vastberadenheid om u te informeren voor en achter de schermen over wat er in Israël gebeurt. Op de manieren zoals we het vandaag hebben gedaan, maar ook onze andere poot die we tot onze werktaak hebben genomen, het bestrijden van antisemitisme. En het bestrijden van antisemitisme is steeds ingewikkelder geworden, omdat als je iets wil bestrijden, je het ook in kaart moet brengen. We gaan met CIDI het komend jaar iets doen wat we tot nu toe niet hebben gedaan, maar in navolging van onze grote broer, de ADL, de Anti-Defamation League in New York, gaan we voor het eerst het komende jaar ook antisemitisme en racisme op het internet monitoren, in kaart brengen. Daar waar wij van jongeren, uw kinderen, uw kleinkinderen horen dat zij zich bedreigd voelen, gebeurt dat steeds vaker en steeds erger en op steeds intimiderende manier via het internet. Intimidaties, mensen die niet meer op internet durven. En we moeten niet vergeten, voor heel veel van ons wellicht, maar zeker voor de jonge generatie, is de social media voor een deel het ware leven geworden. Daar spelen vriendschappen zich af, daar vinden discussies plaats en daar vindt, hoe gek wij het misschien ook vinden, voor heel veel mensen het echte leven plaats. Want daar worden zij gezien en worden zij gehoord, maar worden ze ook geïntimideerd en worden ze ook afgeserveerd. En op dat goed in kaart te kunnen brengen en ook op de politieke agenda te kunnen zetten, gaan wij dat onderzoek doen. Daar zijn resources voor nodig. Daar hebben we u als vriend voor nodig. En voor zover u nog geen vriend bent of donateur van CIDI, roepen wij u hierbij op om dat te worden. Uw geld is goed besteed. Ik heb mijn jasje uitgetrokken en mijn mouwen opgestroopt, omdat ik ervoor sta dat op deze manier wij het komende jaar ook weer uw belangen gaan vertegenwoordigen op de best mogelijke manier. Dat doen wij voor u, met u, maar kunnen we niet zonder u en zonder uw bijdrage in welke vorm dan ook. Ik dank u vanavond voor uw komst. Mocht u vriend willen worden van CIDI, en na zo'n avond als deze kan ik me niet voorstellen dat u dat niet zou willen worden, dan kunt u bij een van onze medewerkers, of op uw stoelen zelfs geloof ik, een formulier invullen. Ik dank u bij voorbaat. Ik wens u wel thuis. Ik hoop dat de kou u mild zal behandelen. Ik hoop elkaar weer in gezondheid te zien. Ik wens u fijne Chanukka-dagen. En voor die kerst vieren, fijne kerstdagen. En voor allen een gezond en mooi jaar. Dank u wel.